The year is 221 BCE. The air, thick with the lingering scent of smoke and ambition, hung heavy over the newly unified land. He was Ying Zheng, born not of prophecy or divine intervention, but of raw, unyielding will. His life began not in the gilded cages of a crowned prince, but as a hostage, a pawn in the brutal chess game of the warring states. Born in the rival state of Zhao, his early years were marked by precarious survival, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the relentless pursuit of power that defined his age. He learned suspicion before trust, ruthlessness before compassion. His father, King Xuanzang of Qin, had been a hostage himself before a shrewd merchant. Li Buwei engineered his return to power. Ying Zheng inherited this legacy of calculated survival, a deep-seated understanding that alliances were temporary, and true authority rested solely on the sharpness of one's sword and the unwavering force of one's will. Upon his father's premature death, Ying Zheng, a mere 13 years old, ascended the throne of Qin. The court was a viper's nest of intrigue. Lu Buwei, now his powerful regent, wielded immense influence, and whispers of his illicit affair with the young king's mother, Queen Dowager Zhao, spread like wildfire. Ying Zheng watched, learned, and waited. He observed the machinations, the subtle poisons of power, and patiently sharpened his own fangs. When the Queen Dowager's new lover, Lao Oi, an impostor eunuch, dared to plot rebellion, Ying Zheng, barely in his 20s, unleashed the full, terrifying force of his burgeoning authority. The rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency. Lao Ai was torn apart by chariots, his entire clan exterminated. Li Buwei, though spared a direct execution, was stripped of his titles and exiled, eventually taking his own life rather than face the emperor's slow, deliberate vengeance. This early purging of his court cemented his absolute control, sending an unequivocal message to all. Dissent would not be tolerated, and only the emperor's will mattered. He was no longer a child king, but the undisputed master of Qindat, with internal rivals eliminated. Ying Zheng turned his gaze outwards, towards the 6 warring states that still defied Qin's dominance. For centuries, China had been a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each vying for supremacy, each with its own customs, currency, and writing. Ying Zheng envisioned something entirely new, a unified realm, all under heaven, governed by a single supreme authority. His armies were not just a collection of soldiers. They were a meticulously organized, relentlessly disciplined war machine. Fueled by Qin's legalist philosophy, which emphasized strict laws and absolute obedience, his soldiers fought with a ferocity unmatched by their rivals. They were rewarded for bravery, punished for cowardice, and driven by a singular purpose: conquest. The campaign was a whirlwind of strategic genius and overwhelming force. State by state, they fell. Han, the smallest, was crushed first in 230 BCE. Then came Zhao in 228 BCE, a brutal conquest that avenged Ying Zheng's childhood as a hostage there. Wei surrendered in 225 BCE after Qin engineers diverted a river to flood its capital. Chu, the largest and most formidable, resisted fiercely, but ultimately succumbed in 223 BCE after a prolonged and devastating campaign. Yan, whose desperate attempt to assassinate Ying Zheng years earlier had only hardened his resolve, was annihilated in 222 BCE. Finally, Qi, the last remaining state, surrendered without a fight in 221 BCE, recognizing the futility of resistance against the unstoppable Qin juggernaut. Rivers ran red, cities burned, and from the ashes of fractured kingdoms, a new nation, larger and more unified than any before it, emerged under the undisputed rule of Qin. Ying Zheng did not merely conquer. He fundamentally transformed the very fabric of Chinese society. He understood that military might alone could not hold such a vast empire together. His ambition was not just territorial, but systemic. He decreed that the disparate currencies of the former states be abolished and replaced with a single, standardized Qin currency. Weights and measures, previously varying wildly from region to region, were standardized, facilitating trade and taxation across the entire realm. Even the axle lengths of carts were made uniform, ensuring that all wagons could use the same ruts carved into the new, grand network of imperial roads that crisscrossed his domain. This seemingly minor detail had immense practical significance, allowing for efficient transport of goods, troops, and official documents across the vast distances of his newly unified empire. Perhaps his most revolutionary act of unification, however, was the standardization of writing. The various states had developed their own distinct scripts over centuries, making interstate communication cumbersome and fostering regional identities. Qin Shi Huangdi mandated a single simplified script known as the Small Seal Script to be used throughout the empire. This act had profound and lasting consequences, fostering a common cultural identity and enabling centralized administration on an unprecedented scale. It laid the foundation for a unified Chinese culture that would endure for millennia, long after his dynasty had crumbled. He also dismantled the old feudal system, replacing hereditary aristocracies with a new administrative structure based on commanderies and prefectures, each governed by centrally appointed officials. This ensured that local power bases were eliminated, and all authority flowed directly from the Emperor Dot, having achieved what no ruler before him had even dared to dream. Ying Zheng declared himself Qin Shi Huangdi, a title pregnant with unprecedented meaning. Qin for his victorious state, Shi meaning first, and Huangdi meaning emperor. The term Huangdi itself was a composite of Huang, August, sovereign, and Di, god, supreme ruler, traditionally used for mythological sage kings. By combining them, he elevated himself above all previous kings, asserting a divine right to rule, claiming a status akin to the mythical Yellow Emperor. He was not just a king of men, but a ruler chosen by heaven, destined to bring order to the entire world. He abolished the practice of posthumous naming by later generations, believing that his own actions should define his legacy, not the judgment of those who came after. He wanted his dynasty to last 10,000 generations. He built on a colossal scale, forever reshaping the landscape of China. He commanded the construction of magnificent palaces, including the Apong Palace, rumored to be vast beyond imagination. He initiated the connection and extension of existing defensive walls into what would become the nascent Great Wall, a monumental undertaking meant to protect his northern borders from nomadic incursions. His ambition was boundless, his vision epic. He had conquered the mortal world, unified a fractured civilization, and laid the administrative groundwork for an empire that would endure in spirit, if not in name, for thousands of years. But beneath the triumphs, beneath the unprecedented power and the grand titles, a chilling obsession began to take root. He had conquered states, reformed societies, built wonders, but even the mightiest emperor, the first emperor, was still just flesh and blood. He was aging. He was vulnerable. And that was a truth he refused to accept. His absolute control over the living world only magnified his profound terror of the inevitable end, the one domain he could not conquer, death. He had created an empire. Now he sought to create an eternal self. And this pursuit, born of both hubris and deep-seated fear, would ultimately lead him down a path of slow, agonizing self-destruction. The empire was established, an edifice of iron, law, and unified script, stretching from the deserts to the sea. Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, held sway over a population of millions, his decrees echoing across vast distances. Yet, even amidst his unparalleled power and the magnificent sprawl of his palaces, a profound restlessness gnawed at him. He walked through his gilded halls, past murals depicting his glorious triumphs, the vanquished kings, the kneeling armies, the unified symbols of his rule. He stood atop mountains he had climbed, surveying a domain he had forged with blood and fire. But the triumphs, the monuments, the very act of creation only magnified a primal, chilling fear that had begun to consume him, the fear of oblivion. He had built testaments to his legacy that would last for centuries, perhaps millennia. But what was legacy without an eternal presence to witness it? How could the first emperor, the divine unifier of all under heaven, simply cease to be? His court, once a bastion of legalist pragmatism, slowly transformed into a fertile ground for the fantastical and the deceptive. It became a magnet for an insidious new breed of confidants, alchemists, sorcerers, and charlatans, all eager to whisper seductive promises of unending life into the emperor's increasingly receptive ear. They flocked from every corner of the empire, drawn by the scent of imperial favor and the immense rewards or brutal punishments that awaited them. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones of mythical islands floating in the eastern sea, lands where immortals dwelled, their bodies untouched by age or decay. They wove elaborate tales of magical herbs that glowed with eternal youth, their leaves shimmering with an otherworldly light. They described elusive elixirs, brewed from the purest, most mystical elements, capable of transforming mortal flesh into something divine and perpetual. The emperor, a man of fierce logic and cold pragmatism, on the battlefield and in the council chambers, became strangely, terrifyingly susceptible to these fantastical tales. His formidable intelligence, once applied to military strategy and bureaucratic reform, was now distorted by a desperate yearning. He, who had dismissed dissenting scholars and burned ancient texts, embraced the most outlandish superstitions, with a fervent belief that bordered on delusion. He funded colossal expeditions, mobilizing immense resources and human lives. Fleets of grand ships, provisioned for long voyages, were dispatched across the perilous eastern sea in search of the fabled Mount Penglai, often described as one of the 3 Isles of the Immortals. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of young men and women were conscripted for these perilous voyages, chosen for their purity and vitality. They were sent off with grand promises and elaborate rituals, but almost universally, they vanished into the vast expanse of the ocean, never to return. The official reports would speak of storms, of sea monsters, of the elusive nature of the immortal realm. The emperor, however, refused to see these as failures. He believed them to be necessary sacrifices, perhaps trials, steps on his arduous path to eternal life, a testament to his unwavering commitment to the ultimate conquest. The most influential of these alchemists was a man named Su Fu, who claimed to possess the secret knowledge of the immortals. He told the emperor that the legendary masters lived on these islands, and only offerings of pure, youthful virgins and vast amounts of tribute would entice them to reveal the elixir of life. Qin Shi Huangdi, blind to the obvious deception, readily agreed, providing Su Fu with thousands of young men and women, vast quantities of grain, tools, and treasure for his supposed voyages. Su Fu, it is believed, eventually sailed away with his large retinue and never returned, perhaps settling on one of the Japanese islands, thus becoming a legendary figure in his own right, but leaving the emperor no closer to his goal. Undeterred by the repeated failures of these expeditions, the emperor's focus shifted inward, towards the alchemists concocting their brews within the palace walls. These individuals, ever eager to please and acutely aware of the potentially fatal consequences of failing to deliver, began to experiment with increasingly bizarre and dangerous ingredients. They told him, with learned gravity, that cinnabar, a vibrant scarlet mineral, contained the very essence of immortality. Cinnabar, they explained, was purified mercury sulfide. And mercury, that shimmering, elusive liquid metal, was, they whispered, the ultimate key. Mercury seemed to defy decay, its perpetual fluidity and resistance to tarnish embodying life itself, an ever-flowing, uncorruptible substance. It seemed to hold the promise of transforming the ephemeral into the eternal. The alchemists created elaborate rituals around the preparation of these elixirs. They ground cinnabar into fine powders, mixed it with other exotic, often toxic, ingredients. Powdered jade, believed to absorb and radiate vital energy. Rare minerals imported from distant lands. And even what they euphemistically called gold. Liquids, which often contained lead or other heavy metals, masquerading as the precious element due to their metallic sheen. They claimed these mixtures were imbued with Ki, the life force, or that they were condensed forms of cosmic energy. The more noxious the fumes, the more violent the reactions during preparation, the more potent the alchemists claimed the elixir would be. The emperor, desperate, consumed these concoctions with unwavering faith. He would drink bowls of what looked like shimmering, metallic liquid, believing he was absorbing the very essence of perpetual life, transmuting his mortal flesh into an unperishable form. He was convinced that the bitter taste, the strange sensations, the unsettling transformations within his body were not signs of poisoning, but rather evidence of the elixir's powerful work, purifying his terrestrial shell, sloughing off the frailties of humanity, and preparing him for divine immortality. He was, with every sip, slowly, meticulously poisoning himself. The seed of madness, watered by his profound fear of death, and constantly flattered by the deceitful promises of his desperate alchemists, had not merely blossomed. It was consuming the very man who had united an empire. The first emperor, absolute, master of the mortal realm, was becoming a willing slave to a fantastical, deadly delusion, trading his vibrant life for the illusion of an eternal one. This pursuit, born of both hubris and deep-seated terror, would lead him down a path of slow, agonizing self-destruction, transforming his body and mind into a ruin as profound as any of the kingdoms he had conquered. The consumption of the golden elixirs became a daily ritual, an increasingly desperate gamble against the inevitable. As the alchemist's promises grew ever bolder, so too did the emperor's physical and mental deterioration. The subtle shifts in his personality, once dismissible as mere imperial eccentricity, became alarmingly pronounced. He was no longer just stern or demanding. He was increasingly irritable, prone to violent, unpredictable rages that terrified his court. His once sharp, incisive mind, capable of envisioning vast military campaigns and intricate administrative reforms, started to falter, losing its precision and clarity, often sinking into confusion or obsessive fixations. The mercury, the lead, the arsenic, and other insidious heavy metals, meticulously concentrated within his daily doses, were systematically attacking his nervous system, his kidneys, his liver, and most terrifyingly, his brain. His body, once robust and commanding, began to betray him in horrifying ways. His skin, which had carried the tan of a warrior and the vigor of a conqueror, took on a pallid, almost metallic sheen, a grayish waxen pallor that whispered of internal decay. His eyes, once piercing and intelligent, often appeared bloodshot, and at times unfocused, betraying the cognitive fog that was settling upon him. His teeth, once strong, began to loosen, some even falling out, while his hair, once thick and dark, thinned drastically, leaving patches of scalp exposed. These were not the signs of divine transformation, but of a body struggling and failing against a relentless onslaught of toxins. He suffered from severe and persistent digestive issues, crippling abdominal pain, chronic nausea, and debilitating diarrhea, often alternating with agonizing constipation. A constant, unquenchable, burning thirst plagued him, a symptom of organ damage and dehydration, which he would try to slake by drinking more of the very elixirs that caused it. Yet, even as these agonizing symptoms manifested, the alchemists, ever present and ever manipulative, reassured him. These, they claimed with solemn faces and intricate explanations, were merely the purification stages, the necessary purging of the mortal dross, the earthly impurities being violently expelled from his transforming body. They asserted that these discomforts, these signs of distress, were not ailments, but rather irrefutable proof that the elixir was working, actively transforming his human form into something truly divine and immortal. And the emperor, desperate for validation, clinging to the only hope offered to him, believed them implicitly, interpreting every new agony as a step closer to his impossible goal. His grand design for his eternal resting place became a vivid manifestation of his mercury-fueled delusion. He famously decreed that his tomb, a subterranean palace beneath a massive mound, would be a representation of his earthly empire, and at its heart, rivers and seas of liquid mercury would flow across its floor, mimicking the great rivers of China. This wasn't merely a symbolic gesture, a grand flourish of imperial majesty. It was an integral, terrifying part of his delusional quest for physical immortality. He believed that his body, interred in this vast, mercury-soaked chamber, would be eternally preserved by the shimmering metal. More disturbingly, he harbored the conviction that even after a temporary death, the life-giving properties of the mercury would revive him, making him truly eternal, a living emperor reigning from beyond the grave. The colossal project of the tomb, with its intricate mechanisms and vast scale, consumed the labor of hundreds of thousands of conscripted workers, many of whom perished during its construction, all in service of a single man's descent into madness. The court physicians, those who truly understood the functions of the human body, were rendered utterly powerless. They witnessed the emperor's alarming decline, recognized the telltale signs of poisoning, and understood the deadly nature of the elixirs. Yet they dared not utter a single word of caution, let alone outright condemnation, against the alchemists. The imperial court operated under a pervasive atmosphere of fear. A word of doubt, a subtle hint of contradiction to the emperor's burgeoning obsession, could mean instant execution. Many learned scholars had already met gruesome fates for simply clinging to old philosophical ideas. To challenge the emperor's divine quest, to suggest that his path to immortality was, in fact, a path to death, would be an act of unfathomable folly. They remained silent, their medical knowledge suppressed by terror, watching the slow, agonizing suicide of their emperor. The changes in his behavior became more pronounced, affecting his interactions with even his closest advisors. His famous distrust blossomed into full-blown paranoia. He suspected betrayal everywhere, saw conspiracies in every corner, and imagined assassins lurking in every shadow. His once methodical approach to governance was increasingly interrupted by fits of rage, irrational demands, and a profound inability to tolerate any form of dissent or even disagreement. He began to demand absolute silence in his presence, interpreting any cough, whisper, or rustle of silk as a sign of disrespect or plotting. He retreated further into himself, isolating himself within the vastness of his palaces, becoming a phantom. Ruler to many, his true condition hidden behind layers of court protocol and carefully curated appearances. This physical and mental decline, directly attributable to the chronic heavy metal poisoning, profoundly impacted his decision-making. His decrees became more arbitrary, his punishments more severe. The brutal efficiency that had characterized his unification of China now manifested as an increasingly capricious and cruel tyranny. The once calculating mind, now clouded and corroded by toxins, interpreted every setback, every challenge, every whisper of discontent as a direct threat to his divine, eternal authority. His pursuit of immortality had not only become a personal tragedy, but was actively transforming the first emperor, the great unifier, into a paranoid, unpredictable despot whose failing body and mind would drag his newly forged empire towards its own inevitable, violent unraveling. The gold he drank, the mercury he embraced, were not the keys to eternal life, but the very instruments of his slow, agonizing, self-inflicted demise. As the poisons continued their relentless assault on his body and mind, the emperor's paranoia, once a subtle undercurrent of his ruthless character, spiraled uncontrollably into a suffocating shroud that enveloped his entire court and, by extension, the empire. The symptoms of heavy metal toxicity became undeniable to anyone who dared to look closely. Tremors in his hands, slurred speech during pronouncements, moments of vacant staring, and an increasing difficulty in maintaining his composure. His once formidable glare was often replaced by a wild, suspicious glint in his eyes, darting from face to face, seeing threats where none existed, interpreting innocent glances as veiled contempt. His movements grew erratic, punctuated by sudden, uncontrolled twitches or periods of rigid stillness. The fear of assassination, a constant companion since his younger days, now consumed him entirely. He became obsessed with elaborate security measures. He ordered the construction of a vast network of hidden tunnels and secret pathways throughout his sprawling palaces in Xianyang, allowing him to move unseen, appearing and disappearing as if by magic. His personal guards were multiplied. Their loyalty tested daily, their ranks purged at the slightest hint of disloyalty. He would change his sleeping chambers nightly, never resting in the same place for 2 consecutive nights, driven by the delusion that an assassin, knowing his pattern, could strike anyone, from the highest minister to the lowest palace servant, who inadvertently revealed his location or even hinted at his whereabouts, faced immediate and brutal execution. Heads rolled for trivial offenses, bodies piled up for perceived slights, creating an atmosphere of palpable terror where silence became the only safe expression. His distrust extended to every corner of his court. No one, not even his most loyal ministers or the eunuchs who attended to his every need, was safe from his capricious wrath. Advisors who had served him for decades found themselves suddenly under suspicion, their loyalty questioned, their families purged, their lives forfeit based on a fleeting suspicion or a misconstrued word. The Grand Counselor Li Si, a shrewd legalist who had helped him unify China, found himself increasingly navigating a treacherous minefield, his own survival dependent on his ability to anticipate and flatter the emperor's increasingly irrational desires. This era became characterized by constant purges, arbitrary arrests, and summary executions, turning the once efficient Qin administration into a quivering, terrified entity where self-preservation trumped all else. The emperor was not merely ruling through fear. He was actively poisoning the very relationships that upheld his power, isolating himself in a gilded cage of his own making, surrounded only by trembling SYCOPHANTS. Beyond physical security, his paranoia manifested as an insatiable desire for absolute ideological control. He could not tolerate any dissent, any challenge to his unique authority, any idea that might undermine his divine status or, crucially, his quest for immortality. The intellectual ferment that had characterized the Warring States period, with its myriad schools of thought, Confucianism, Taoism, Mohism, and others, was seen not as a source of wisdom, but as a dangerous threat. Scholars, particularly Confucians, often quoted ancient texts and historical precedents to offer subtle criticisms of his harsh rule, or to advocate for a different model of governance. They also cast doubt on the very notion of immortality, emphasizing the cyclical nature of life and death. This was an affront to a man who saw himself as transcending all natural laws. The infamous burning of books and burying of scholars, Fenshu Kengru, was a direct and horrifying consequence of this escalating paranoia and his desire for absolute intellectual purity. In 213 BCE, upon the urging of his chief minister, Li Si, who argued that independent thought and historical precedent posed a threat to the emperor's absolute authority, Qin Shi Huangdi issued a decree that would forever stain his legacy. All historical records not pertaining to the Qin state were to be burned. All philosophical texts, particularly those of the Confucian school, were to be handed over to the authorities for incineration. The only exceptions were books on medicine, divination, agriculture, and the official history of the Qin state. This was not merely an act of censorship. It was an attempt to erase the past, to sever the intellectual roots of his subjects, and to rewrite history from a single imperial perspective. He sought to create a clean slate where only his narrative, his laws, and his ideology would prevail. The chilling sequel to this act of intellectual destruction occurred in 212 BCE, when some scholars resisted, secretly hiding banned texts or openly criticizing the emperor's tyranny and his futile pursuit of immortality. Qin Shi Huangdi reacted with savage fury. He ordered hundreds of scholars, some accounts say 460, though the exact number is debated, to be rounded up and brutally executed. The most infamous method of their execution was being buried alive. This horrifying spectacle was meant to send an unequivocal message. Intellectual dissent was treason, and the emperor's authority, including his divine mandate and his quest for eternal life, was beyond question. This act plunged China into an intellectual dark age, stifling free thought and critical inquiry for generations. It showed how deeply his obsession with immortality had warped his governance, transforming it from pragmatic rule into a brutal totalitarianism driven by his personal fears. The intellectual landscape of China was sacrificed on the altar of his poisoned mind. Meanwhile, the emperor's physical manifestations of power continued unabated, driven by the same boundless ambition and fear that fueled his personal quest for immortality. The construction of the Great Wall intensified dramatically. While defensive structures had existed along China's northern borders for centuries, Qin Shi Huangdi conceived of a truly monumental undertaking, connecting these disparate walls and extending them into a single colossal defensive line, thousands of miles long, stretching across mountains and valleys. Millions of conscripted laborers, soldiers, and even convicted criminals were forced into brutal labor under unimaginable conditions. The terrain was unforgiving, the climate extreme, the work relentlessly arduous. Death tolls were staggeringly high, with countless bodies buried within the very foundations of the wall, earning it the grim moniker, the longest cemetery in the world. This was not just a military project. It was a physical manifestation of his desire for eternal security, a literal barrier against chaos and invasion, mirroring his internal struggle against the chaos of death itself. It was built on the immense suffering of his populace, a testament to his disregard for human life when pitted against his grand designs. Alongside the Great Wall, his relentless drive for absolute control necessitated other monumental public works. He oversaw the construction of an extensive network of imperial roads radiating from his capital, totaling thousands of miles. These were designed not just for efficient travel, but for rapid deployment of troops and swift transmission of imperial decrees. Vast canal systems were also dug, facilitating transport and irrigation. While these projects would indeed serve future dynasties, their immediate human cost was immense. Farmers were ripped from their lands, families broken apart, and entire regions impoverished by the constant demands for labor and resources. The pressure for completion was relentless, punishments for failure severe, and the lives of the common. People were deemed utterly expendable in the face of the emperor's boundless will and his increasingly deranged vision of an eternally ordered empire. But no project consumed the emperor's attention or the empire's resources quite like the construction of his mausoleum. This colossal subterranean complex, begun shortly after his ascension and intensified dramatically in his final years, was not merely a tomb. It was a vast, self-contained universe designed to mirror his earthly empire and ensure his eternal reign in the afterlife. The scale was staggering: a central burial mound, an outer and inner wall, and an elaborate network of subterranean palaces, storehouses, and ceremonial chambers. It was a project shrouded in absolute secrecy, with anyone involved sworn to silence under pain of death. And at its heart, according to historical accounts, were the rivers and seas of liquid mercury, flowing across the tomb's floor, representing the great rivers and oceans of China. This wasn't merely a symbolic representation of his dominion. It was, in the emperor's poisoned mind, a literal mechanism for his physical immortality. He believed the mercury would preserve his body, and perhaps even revive him, allowing him to rule eternally from within his underground realm. The most famous component of his mausoleum, the terracotta army, provides a chilling insight into his megalomania. Thousands upon thousands of life-sized terracotta warriors, chariots, and horses, each individually sculpted with remarkable detail, were created to guard his tomb. This army was not merely an artistic marvel. It was a proxy for the imperial army meant to accompany and protect him in the afterlife, ensuring his power remained absolute even beyond the grave. The construction of this monumental force and the entire mausoleum complex consumed vast numbers of laborers and artisans, draining the empire's resources and reflecting the emperor's desperate attempts to defy mortality. A ongoing, grueling work on these projects, coupled with the increasing demands of his personal, poisoned quest, pushed the empire to its breaking point. His absolute rule, meant to create an eternal, ordered society, was instead sowing the seeds of its own violent destruction, fueled by the terrifying combination of boundless ambition and the insidious decay of a mind consumed by mercury. The empire was paying in lives and freedom for the slow, agonizing suicide of its first, and ultimately last emperor. The emperor's physical decline, once a carefully guarded secret, became undeniably apparent, a tragic testament to the cumulative damage inflicted by years of mercury and other heavy metal poisoning. Though his officials desperately tried to maintain the illusion of his vigor, the truth was evident in his deteriorating body and erratic behavior. His once firm grip now trembled uncontrollably, his pronouncements often dissolving into slurred, incomprehensible words. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, would frequently glaze over, revealing moments of alarming detachment or vacant stupor. His once powerful frame had become skeletal, his skin drawn taut over protruding bones, giving him a cadaverous appearance that horrified those close to him. He suffered from chronic, debilitating pain throughout his body, punctuated by unpredictable bouts of fever and violent convulsions. Hallucinations became more frequent, and his fits of uncontrollable rage, often directed at unseen enemies, were followed by periods of profound exhaustion and near catatonic stillness. Despite his extreme frailty, and perhaps because of it, Qin Shi Huangdi embarked on several grand tours of his empire in his final years. These were not merely inspections of his domain, but desperate, almost ritualistic, quests for renewed promises of immortality. He sought out more alchemists eager for new elixirs, new insights, a breakthrough that would finally grant him the eternal life he craved. He traveled extensively, venturing to the eastern coastlines, driven by the persistent myth of the Isles of the Immortals and the elusive magical herbs they harbored. Each journey was a testament to his unwavering, albeit delusional, belief reality of these imperial tours stood in stark contrast to their projected image of imperial power. The emperor, a shadow of his former self, was often confined to his heavily curtained carriage, hidden from public view. When he did appear, it was a brief, tightly controlled spectacle, designed to mask his alarming condition. He was propped up, his face painted, his movements carefully choreographed, projecting a facade of strength that belied his profound weakness. The contradiction was stark. The most powerful man in China, the unifier of all under heaven, was a frail, trembling wreck, isolated by his own poisoned body and the elaborate deception designed to conceal it. His inner circle, particularly the chief eunuch Zhao Gao and the Grand Counselor Li Si, lived in a state of constant anxiety. They were privy to the horrific details of his decline. They witnessed the fevers, the vomiting, the incoherent ramblings, the moments when his body spasmed violently. Their primary task became managing the illusion of his health, knowing that the revelation of his frailty, let alone his death, could plunge the newly unified empire into chaos and potentially cost them their own lives. Official reports were meticulously fabricated, describing the emperor's robust health and his vigorous spirit, presenting a carefully curated image to the provinces. Any rumors of his illness were brutally suppressed, and those who dared to whisper them disappeared. The court physicians, trapped in this terrifying charade, continued to administer the very poisons that were killing him. Their own medical reports, if any existed, would have been filled with euphemisms, melancholy, vapors, imbalances of humors, anything but the truth of heavy metal poisoning. They were powerless to intervene, their professional ethics overridden by the absolute terror of defying the emperor's delusional will. They were forced to be complicit in his slow, agonizing suicide, watching a man of immense power literally consume himself. The final, fatal journey began in 210 BCE. Qin Shi Huangdi, despite being severely weakened, embarked on another extensive tour to the eastern parts of his empire, possibly in a last, desperate attempt to find Su Fu or another source of the immortality elixir. The route was long and arduous, pushing his ravaged body to its absolute limits. His carriage, once a symbol of imperial majesty, effectively became his sickbed, its interior transformed into a private infirmary. The air inside would have been heavy with the metallic tang of mercury and the oppressive smell of his decaying body. Despite efforts to mask it, during this journey, his health plummeted catastrophically. He was ravaged by excruciating abdominal pain, uncontrollable vomiting, severe dehydration, and escalating fevers. Convulsions seized his body with increasing frequency, leaving him exhausted and unresponsive. These were classic textbook symptoms of advanced mercury poisoning, now in its terminal stage. Yet, even in his final moments, his mind, though ravaged, remained consumed by the fantasy that had dictated his later years. He continued to demand more elixirs, his fading consciousness convinced that the breakthrough was imminent, that one more dose, one more magical brew, would finally grant him the ultimate transformation into an immortal. He died in his carriage, hundreds of miles from his capital, in the commandery of Shakyu, isolated by his own paranoia and the suffocating conspiracy that enveloped him. He died alone in the sense that none could truly share his suffering or break through his delusion, surrounded by sycophants more concerned with their own survival than his actual well-being. The immediate aftermath of his death was a scene of frantic, terrifying secrecy. Zhao Gao, the chief eunuch, and Li Si, the Grand Counselor, were the first to realize the emperor was gone. The implications were catastrophic. A dead emperor meant political instability, potential revolts, and an immediate challenge to their own power. They immediately conspired to hide his death from the rest of the entourage and, crucially, from the empire. They kept his body hidden within the curtained imperial carriage, continuing the journey as if the emperor were still alive, merely indisposed. To mask the inevitable odor of his decaying corpse in the sweltering summer heat, they resorted to a grotesque ruse. They ordered several carts of salted fish to be transported directly alongside the imperial carriage. The stench of rotting fish was meant to overwhelm and conceal the smell of a decomposing emperor, a macabre symbol of the deception at the heart of the Qin court. Their next, even more audacious, step was to orchestrate a fraudulent succession. The emperor's eldest son, Fu Su, was a strong, popular figure, known for his more compassionate nature and his critical views of his father's harsh policies, especially the burning of books. He represented a threat to Zhao Gao and Li Si's ruthless ambitions. Instead, they favored Hu Hai, a younger son, known to be weak-willed, pleasure-loving, and easily manipulated. Zhao Gao forged an imperial decree, supposedly from the deceased emperor, ordering Fu Su to commit suicide for disloyalty and appointing Hu Hai as the new emperor. The forged letter, delivered to Fu Su and his general Meng Tan, achieved its desired effect. Fu Su, tragically obedient, took his own life. Meng Tan, though suspicious, was eventually imprisoned and also forced to commit suicide. With Fu Su eliminated and Hu Hai installed, Zhao Gao and Li Si believed they had secured their power. The carriage, now carrying a decomposing corpse and a carefully constructed lie, continued its mournful, secret journey back to the capital, Xianyang, a ticking time bomb of deception that would soon explode and bring down the very empire Qin Shi Huangdi had so brutally forged. The king who had sought to drink gold and bathe in mercury had died an agonizing, isolated death, still clinging to a delusion. His end a chillingly direct consequence of his desperate, self-poisoning quest for immortality. The Qin Shi Huangdi was dead. Yet the deception continued, a festering secret contained within the imperial carriage as it slowly made its way back to Xianyang. The return journey was a macabre procession, the stench of decaying fish barely masking the odor of the deceased emperor, a grotesque charade meticulously orchestrated by Zhao Gao and Li Si. Only upon their safe arrival at the capital, and after carefully consolidating their control over the palace and the military, was the first emperor's death finally announced. The revelation sent shockwaves through the court, quickly followed by a pervasive sense of dread and uncertainty. Among the populace, whispers of injustice concerning Fu Su's forced suicide circulated, fueling a growing undercurrent of resentment against the new regime. The fragile new order was embodied by Hu Hai, the young, malleable son placed on the Ai's throne. He was a puppet emperor from the outset, utterly dependent on Zhao Gao for guidance and susceptible to his every whim. Zhao Gao, cunning and utterly ruthless, wasted no time consolidating his absolute power. He systematically eliminated any potential rivals, beginning with Li Si himself. The Grand Counselor, once Zhao Gao's co-conspirator, found himself framed for treason, subjected to the horrific 5 punishments, including tattooing, cutting off the nose, severing of feet, castration, and death, and ultimately executed, along with his entire clan. Zhao Gao then turned on other loyal Qin nobles and officials, purging anyone who might challenge his authority or expose his machinations. The court became a mirror of the late emperor's final, paranoid phase, but with Zhao Gao, the puppet master, now pulling the strings with terrifying proficiency. The infamous pointing to a deer and calling it a horse incident perfectly encapsulated Zhao Gao's tyrannical control. One day, Zhao Gao presented a deer to Hu Hai, claiming it was a horse. When some officials dared to point out that it was, in fact, a deer, Zhao Gao had them secretly executed. This act, seemingly trivial, was a chilling demonstration of his power. He could force the court to deny reality, compelling them to agree with an obvious falsehood, thus terrifying anyone who might dare to contradict him. The second emperor, Hu Hai, became increasingly isolated and paranoid, living in a constant state of fear, surrounded by sycophants who would only tell him what he wished to hear, or what Zhao Gao wished him to hear. But the vast empire held together for barely a decade by the sheer force of Qin Shi Huangdi's will, could not long withstand the void left by his death and the incompetence and tyranny of his successors. The brutal legalist system, with its harsh laws, oppressive taxes, and relentless forced labor for monumental projects, had alienated the vast majority of the population. The burning of books had left an intellectual vacuum, and the suppression of regional identities had festered into deep resentment. The people yearned for an end to the ceaseless conscription for the Great Wall, the roads, and the emperor's tomb. The first spark ignited in 209 BCE, less than a year after Qin Shi Huangdi's death. Two humble farmers, Shen Sheng and Wu Guang, conscripted for military service and delayed by heavy rains, faced execution for failing to meet their rendezvous point. Realizing they had nothing to lose, they famously declared, "Kings and nobles, are they born to be so?" and launched a rebellion. This simple question, challenging the very foundation of hereditary power, resonated deeply with the oppressed masses. Their uprising, initially small, quickly swelled into a massive popular movement, attracting discontented farmers, former nobles, and disgruntled soldiers from across the empire. The Qin armies, once invincible under Qin Shi Huangdi, found themselves spread thin across a vast empire, demoralized by the internal purges and facing an enemy driven by desperation. Local administrators, now without the terrifying direct authority of the first emperor, struggled to maintain control. The centralized, authoritarian system, so effective in consolidating power, proved brittle and unsustainable once the strong, albeit poisoned, hand of its founder was gone. The empire fractured as regional warlords and charismatic rebel leaders, such as the strategic Liu Bang and the formidable Xiang Yu, rose to challenge the crumbling Qin authority. The fall of the Qin dynasty was swift and violent. Hu Hai, increasingly aware of the spiraling chaos and Zhao Gao's growing ambitions, found himself trapped. In 207 BCE, Zhao Gao, fearing for his own life as the rebellions closed in, forced Hu Hai to commit suicide. Zhao Gao then briefly placed Ziying, a nephew of Hu Hai, on the throne, but his reign was even shorter. Ziying, recognizing Zhao Gao's treachery, had him assassinated shortly thereafter. By this point, the capital Xianyang was surrounded. In 206 BCE, Liu Bang's forces captured Xianyang, bringing an end to the Qin dynasty. The magnificent Apang Palace, a symbol of Qin Shi Huangdi's boundless ambition, was famously set ablaze by Xiang Yu, burning for months and reducing much of the capital to ashes. The dynasty, which Qin Shi Huangdi had envisioned lasting 10,000 generations, had lasted a mere 15 years after its founder's death, a spectacular and brutal collapse. Today, the most enduring and awe-inspiring legacy of Qin Shi Huangdi is not his brief dynasty, but his immense mausoleum and the silent, standing army that guards it. The burial mound, still largely unexcavated, is believed to contain the vast subterranean palace with its rivers of liquid mercury, a testament to his obsession with physical immortality. It is a grand, terrifying monument to a failed quest, a tangible representation of a man's desperate attempt to defy nature. The Terracotta Army, unearthed in the 20th century, stands as a magnificent artistic and historical wonder. Thousands of life-sized warriors, chariots, and horses, each unique, preserving a snapshot of ancient military might. But it is also a chilling symbol of forced labor, unimaginable human cost, and the emperor's ultimate hubris. Each silent face in that army speaks not just of military power, but of the countless lives consumed by the emperor's insatiable desire for an eternal reign. The story of Qin Shi Huangdi is a profound and bitter irony. The emperor who sought eternal life through toxic means hastened his own agonizing demise, poisoning his body and mind. The empire he brutally unified and ruled with an iron fist, intended to last forever, collapsed almost immediately after his death. Unable to sustain the weight of his personal madness and the systemic oppression he had unleashed. His ultimate legacy is not an eternal physical presence, but the enduring memory of a tyrant whose pursuit of an impossible dream led to his own slow, agonizing suicide, and in turn unleashed chaos upon the land he had so fiercely brought to order. His body, intended to be immortal, turned to dust, a stark and chilling reminder that even the most powerful of men cannot escape the mortal coil, especially when they actively embrace their own destruction in the pursuit of an impossible fantasy. His ambition laid the groundwork for future imperial China, but his personal tragedy served as a profound cautionary tale of power, paranoia, and the futile, destructive nature of hubris.